This video is going to show you how to do a localizer back course. These are very rare in the United States and other parts of the world, and that's why they can be a little bit confusing sometimes. They're just not flown that often. Two things make these type of approaches different. Instead of setting in the final approach course of 016, we set in the front course of 196. And this is in the instant of an airplane with an HSI. The second thing that's different, normally we would press the nav button when intercepting the final approach course or cleared for the approach. In this case, you're not going to press nav, we're going to select the BC or back course button. Other than that, this approach is pretty straightforward. Fly ahead and intercept the final approach course, watch each step down, go down to the next altitude, keep doing that until you get down to minimums. So the way this approach works, the localizer is actually off of the opposite runway, which would be 20 right. So we're just getting the signal off the back side of the localizer antenna. With the final approach course from that runway set in, we will not get reverse sensing. And when we press the back course button, that's going to tell the autopilot to fly the opposite direction of what it normally would with the nav button selected. And you're probably wondering, if there's so much work involved in this, why would you do it in the first place? Well, the answer to that might be wind. You can't land on the other runway due to too strong of a tailwind, so you need to go the other way. And this is one more way to get in on an approach. Let's go put these principles to work and do this approach in the TBM 930. Thanks to Navigraph, you can see our position on the approach plate. The approach has already been selected in the FMS. And in this airplane in Flight Sim 2020, when the approach was selected and I put in the localizer frequency, it automatically tuned in the front course of 196. But it actually tuned 195, as you can see on the course right here, but it's not going to make a difference. Another thing to point out quickly, when I pressed BC the first time, the flight mode enunciator did not change to LOC as it says right now. It changed to heading. I pressed nav and then went back to BC. It stayed in LOC. In real life, that should say BC instead of localizer. The other thing we need to do this approach is this note down on the bottom. Dual VOR receivers or DME required with WUNAD intersection. In order to use the lower straight-in landing minimums, you have to be able to identify WUNAD. You can do that with DME, or you can do that with the second VOR with this cross radial. And you can probably guess which one I'm going to use. The easy one, DME. We will pull up DME. That's much easier than using dual VORs. You can see the head of the HSI needle is actually behind us. If we were to press nav right now, and if we hadn't pressed the BC or back course button, the airplane would make a turn and it would fly us out over the ocean into oblivion. So as we reference the approach plate, we can see our position. We are between minnow and NUPO. NUPO is at 4.5 DME. We need to be at 1,600 feet by the time we hit that waypoint. 1,600 is set in the altitude selector, and we're using vertical speed to go down to that. While we're working our way to NUPO intersection, the minimus section has multiple areas that we need to look at. The left side has two separate minimums, both for the same intersection, but with different altimeter settings. If you have the local altimeter setting from Santa Ana, you can go down to 480 feet. If you have the Fullerton altimeter setting, you can only go to 520 feet. You would normally use the altimeter setting from Santa Ana. If for some reason you don't have an altimeter setting, the weather reporting is broken, then you would have to use the altimeter setting from Fullerton. And in this column, same scenario, one airport versus the other for an altimeter setting, but this is without being able to identify WUNAD intersection. But as the note says, dual VOR receivers or DME required with WUNAD. We have both. We're using DME. We can identify it. We can go down to that minimum. And our approach category is faster than 90 knots, so we're going to be in category B, which is here. So we'll be able to do this approach to 480 feet, and we need 1 mile visibility. When we're at minimums, 480 feet will be 424 feet above the ground. So when we check the weather, if the ceiling was reported at 300 feet, chances are we would not get in on this approach. We would end up going missed. And if that were to happen, we would climb to 800 feet, then a climbing left turn to 2,600 feet, direct to SLI or Seal Beach VOR, and hold. But as you can see looking out the window, we're not going to be doing that today. As we look back down the approach plate, the next step down begins at 4.5 DME over Nupo intersection. Once we see 4.5 DME, we're going to descend to 560 feet. We can't set 560, so we're going to set the next best thing, 600 feet in the altitude selector. And you can see that up here. Once that's done, we can hit VS, vertical speed, pitch down to about 1,000 feet a minute, and head down to 600 feet. At our current ground speed, we're doing 2 miles per minute. 120 knots over the ground is 2 miles a minute. 180 is 3. 240 is 4. We have 2.7 miles between these two fixes. We're doing 2 miles per minute. Let's just round it, make it simple. Say it's going to take us 1 minute to get down. We're at 1,600 going to 600. We have 1,000 feet to lose. 1 minute, 1,000 feet per minute. As we approach Woonat intersection, if you are flying an airplane that didn't have DME or for some reason you did not want to use DME to identify that fix, you would have to use the 122-degree radial off of Seal Beach to identify that fix. In this airplane, you would select bearing 2 to VOR 2 or nav 2, and when the needle hits 122, that would be Woonat intersection. And I'm saying this next part a little bit out of order. When we're putting the gear and flaps down, we want to be fully configured, gear down, full flaps prior to the final approach fix. That was behind us at Nupo. We already are fully configured. I just wanted to point that out in case anybody sees it or questions it. Now as we approach 600 feet and it captures, the next altitude we're going to come down to are minimums of 480 feet. And as we said earlier with the TBM, we cannot set altitude by 10s. We can only do 100s. We cannot go below the MDA. So we're going to set the next best thing, 500 feet. And you can see 500 foot here in the altitude selector. I drew a box around the PAPI, and that's because I wanted to draw attention to it. Due to the limitation of the autopilot, this approach is going to bring us to 500 feet. Once we get to 500 feet, we're not going to descend until that glide path is 2 white, 2 red. And once that happens, we're going to follow that down to the runway. And that will give us obstacle clearance. If we were doing this approach in instrument meteorological conditions and we didn't see the runway, we would then stay at this altitude until Zeus intersection, which is 0.5 DME. If we didn't see the runway by that point, we would go missed. And that is known as the missed approach point. From there, you would follow the missed approach procedure up here. But since we can control the weather in Flight Sim 2020, we're not going to do that today. That's going to be another video on a different day. We're going to go ahead and land by looking out the window and using the VASI. And we are slightly high. We got 3 white. There's 2 white, 2 red. We're on glide path. And that's pretty much it. You guys have seen me land this before in different videos. The biggest thing with the Localizer back course, remember, front course, press the BC button. If you do those 2 things, it'll work just like a Localizer. And to my knowledge, Localizer back courses don't have glide slopes. I have read something where there are some out there that do have it, but it would have its own glide slope antenna, not the one off the other side like the Localizer uses in the back course. Earlier in the video, I talked about approach categories. I said we were category B. If you watch my London Steep ILS approach video, I explain approach categories in that video. And I will throw that link up at the top, and I will put it in the description. That's all I have for now. One of the next videos I'm going to do is an NDB approach with some extra little features added to it. And as always, if you enjoy this content from a professional pilot and want to ask questions and get answered, be sure to subscribe. And even if you don't subscribe, I'll still answer.